My uncle told me that if I walked out the door that night, I should not bother coming back. He said it the way a man says something he has been waiting a long time to say. Quiet, final, the kind of words that do not echo because they were never meant to be taken back. I stood in the doorway of that little house in the valley with my whole life packed into a single canvas backpack, and I looked at him one last time. Royce Calder, my mother's brother, a man who had taken me in 5 years ago, not out of love, but out of obligation, and who had reminded me of that obligation every single day since. All I had in that backpack was a can of beans, my grandfather's old saw with the worn wooden handle, and a folded map that everyone in the family had always called an old man's fantasy. I was 19 years old, and I had nowhere left to go, so I walked.
The cold came early to Stonewall Gap that year. It rolled down off the high peaks sometime in late September. Ahead of schedule, meaner than anyone remembered. It settled over the town like a debt nobody had agreed to take on. The creek that fed the eastern pastures dropped to a thread of water over stone. The grass went brittle and pale. Cattle stood in the fields with their heads low and their ribs starting to show. And the men who owned them stood on porch rails and stared hard at the horizon, as if staring might break the sky open. It didn't. Stonewall Gap was not a pretty town. It had never tried to be. It had been hacked out of necessity, not vision. A cluster of timber buildings and hard-packed dirt streets wedged between a granite bluff to the north, and a stretch of open range that ran on until it hit the edge of the world. One general store, one saloon that turned into a courthouse whenever the circuit judge passed through, a church that leaked when it rained, and enough stubborn, watchful people to make sure nobody ever got too comfortable.
I thought it was just a story back then, the kind grandfathers tell to a child half asleep against their chest. But Walter Ezra Hartwell was not a man who told stories without reasons buried somewhere inside them, and I have come to believe that even then, with me small and warm and certain the world would never change, he was telling me something he needed me to remember for a day he could see coming and I could not. He taught me things in that kitchen and in the yard behind it, how to read the sky for the weather it was carrying, how to find north without the sun, how to lay a fire so it would catch the first time and burn slow. I was a girl who liked the woods more than the company of people, and he was the one person in my whole life who never once told me that was strange. My parents were gone by the time I was 12, a winter road and a patch of black ice and a guardrail that gave way, and after that my grandfather was the only warm thing left in the world to me. He would take me up into the hills on the long summer evenings and name the trees for me and tell me that a person who knew how to be alone in the woods would never truly be alone anywhere. I did not understand then that he was preparing me. I thought he was only loving me. I know now that for Walter Hartwell, those two things were never separate. He disappeared when I was 14. That is the word the family used, disappeared, as if he had simply evaporated one ordinary morning. They said he had gone strange in his old age. They said his mind had started to slip, that he wandered off into the mountains one autumn and never came back, and that somewhere out there under the great trees his bones had long since gone cold. They held a service with no body. They folded his memory up and put it away like an old coat nobody wanted to wear anymore. I never believed it, not the way they told it, because the grandfather I knew did not get lost. He was the most careful man I had ever met. He could read the sky the way other men read a newspaper. He knew which way was north without ever looking at the sun. A man like that does not simply wander off and vanish. But I was 14, and nobody listens to a 14-year-old girl who has just lost the only person who ever made her feel like she mattered. After that, it was just me and the Calders. My Uncle Royce and his cold, quiet house and his colder, quieter rules. He never raised a hand to me. I will give him that. But there are ways to make a person feel unwanted that leave no bruises. The plate set just a little too far from the others. The long silences at the table. The way he looked at me sometimes, like I was a bill that kept arriving in the mail long after he thought it had been paid. I learned to be small in that house. I learned to keep to my room with the door shut and the woods of my grandfather's teaching alive only in my memory. I kept his old saw under my bed because Royce had thrown out almost everything else of his, and I kept the map sewn into the lining of my coat because some animal part of me knew that if Royce ever found it, he would take it from me the way he took everything. 5 years I lived like that, 5 years of being tolerated. And in all that time, I never stopped feeling late at night that my grandfather was somewhere out there still, that the story they told about him was a lie, that the careful man who taught me to read the sky had not simply walked into the trees and let them have him. That last night, the argument was about money. It was always about money with Royce. He had been going through my grandfather's old papers again, the ones he kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, and when I asked him what he was looking for, he turned on me with a face I had never seen before, a hungry face, a face with something desperate behind the eyes. He told me I knew more than I was saying. He told me my grandfather had hidden things, and that I had been the old man's favorite, and that if I knew where anything was kept, I had better tell him now. I told him the truth. I told him I did not know what he was talking about. He did not believe me. And that was when he said it. If you walk out that door, do not bother coming back. So I went to my room and I took the saw from under my bed and I took the map from the lining of my coat where it had waited 5 years, and I stood for a moment with both of them in my hands. The map he had pressed into my fingers the last summer I ever saw him folding my small hand around it and telling me to keep it safe, to keep it secret, to bring it here someday when I needed a harbor of my own. I had kept it for 5 years. I had never understood it, and now with my uncle's words still hanging in the cold air of that house, I finally understood that the time he spoke of had come. The forest at night is not silent the way people think. It breathes. The wind moves through the high branches like water moving over stones, and the trees lean and groan against one another, and far off you can hear things shifting in the dark that you will never see and never name. I walked through all of it with my grandfather's map held against my chest and his old saw knocking softly against my spine with every step, and I was not as afraid as I should have been, because every tree I passed was a tree he had taught me the name of, and every sound the dark made was a sound he had taught me to read. The cold came up through the soles of my boots. My fingers went numb around the folded paper. Twice I stopped certain I had lost the trail, certain I had walked myself into a wilderness that would swallow me whole before morning, and twice I unfolded the map by the thin blue light of the moon and found the next marking, the next bend in the creek, the next ridgeline drawn in my grandfather's careful hand. He had drawn this for me, years before I would ever need it. He had known. I did not understand yet how much he had known. It was nearly midnight when I came through the last stand of pines and into the clearing, and I stopped so suddenly that my own breath caught in my throat. There, rising out of the fog like something from the edge of a dream, stood the largest tree I had ever seen in my life. A giant sequoia, ancient beyond reckoning, its trunk wider than the house I had just left, its crown lost somewhere far above me in the dark, and built into its branches, swallowed by them, clinging to them, like a thing grown rather than made, was the treehouse, my grandfather's quiet harbor. It was real. After all these years, after all the times the family had laughed at the old man's fantasy, it was real, and it was standing right in front of me. I had carried the picture of it in my mind for 5 years, built from a child's half, memories of the way he spoke, and yet I had never truly let myself believe it was more than a story. And here it was dark and enormous against the fog, more real than the house I had left, more real than the uncle who had closed his door behind me. And it looked like it could fall at any moment. I walked closer, and the closer I got, the worse it looked. A ladder of wooden steps spiraled up around the trunk, but half of them were rotted black, sagging away from the bark, hanging by single rusted nails. The platform above leaned at a sickening angle. Boards were missing. One whole side of the roof had buckled inward like a broken rib. In the moonlight, it looked less like a home and more like a wound the tree had grown around and could not heal. Something inside me went cold then, not the cold of the night air, a deeper cold, the understanding of where I actually was and what I had actually done and how very alone I had made myself. I had walked 10 miles into the wilderness to reach a ruin, and I had no way back. I stood at the bottom of that ladder for a long time, looking up at those rotten steps, disappearing into the fog and the branches, and I understood with a terrible clarity that this was the whole of my choice. Either this broken tree would become my home, or the forest would take me long before the winter ever did. There was no third road. There was no going back to a man who had already closed the door behind me. The cold made the decision feel simple in the way that only true cold can. Climb or freeze at the bottom of the only thing my grandfather had ever left me. So I put my hand on the first step. It held. I put my weight on it slowly, the way you test ice on a pond, and the wood groaned, but it held. I climbed to the second step and the third. The rope rail that ran along the outside was frayed and slick with damp, but it was something to hold, and I held it the way a drowning person holds anything at all. The higher I climbed, the quieter the world became. By the time I reached the halfway point, the sounds of the forest floor had faded beneath me, and there was only the wind and the slow creak of the old wood and the enormous breathing presence of the tree itself. I made the mistake of looking down once. The ground had vanished into the fog. I could not see how far I would fall. Somehow, that was worse than seeing it. My grandfather's voice came to me then from some long summer evening, years gone, telling me that the trick to high places was to keep your eyes on the next handhold and never on the drop, and I fixed my eyes on the next step, and I did not look down again. The last few steps were the worst. They sagged under me like they were made of wet paper, and one of them cracked clean through as my boot left it, the broken piece tumbling away into the white below. Without a sound I could hear. My heart slammed against my ribs. My hands shook on the rope. For one long moment I simply clung there, halfway between the earth and the sky, too frightened to go up and too far gone to go down. And then I thought of my uncle's face, that hungry, desperate face. Do not bother coming back. I went up, I pulled myself onto the platform on my hands and knees, and the whole structure shifted beneath my weight with a long, low groan that I felt in my teeth. For a moment, I did not move at all. I just lay there on the cold, warped boards, breathing, listening to the tree settle around me, waiting to feel if it would hold. It held. I had made it, high above the Oregon forest, with nowhere else left to go in all the world. I had made it to the quiet harbor, and standing up at last, looking around at the place my grandfather had built with his own 2 hands, I felt the first strange flicker of something I had not felt in 5 long years. I felt close to him again. The inside of the treehouse was worse than the outside had promised, and somehow better too. The single room was small, no larger than a garden shed, with a low, slanted ceiling and a floor that tilted just enough to make you feel the trees swaying when the wind came through. Cold air poured in through a dozen gaps in the walls where the boards had pulled apart over the years. In the corner, the roof sagged so badly I could see a thin gray slice of the night sky through the cracks, and the moonlight fell through it onto the floor in a long, pale blade. I dropped my backpack, and the platform groaned again under the sudden weight, and I stood very still until it stopped. For a while, I did nothing but look. There was an old iron stove bolted into the corner near the wall, rust eating up its sides, but its pipe still ran straight up and disappeared cleanly through the roof. Beside it sat a stack of empty glass jars, every one of them wrapped in dust, so thick it looked like felt like nobody had laid a finger on them in a long time. And then I noticed something that stopped me where I stood. Everything in that room had been placed. That was the thing. Not abandoned, not scattered the way a place gets scattered when someone leaves in a hurry or never means to return. Everything had been set down carefully, deliberately, the way a man arranges things he fully intends to come back to. The jars were stacked, not strewn. There was a wool blanket folded into a perfect square, sealed inside an old wooden chest against the far wall. A length of fishing line hung coiled on a nail, and on the shelf above the stove sat a small coffee tin, and when I pried off its lid with cold fingers, I found it full of dry wooden matches, every one of them wrapped in wax paper to keep out the damp. That stopped me cold, because matches do not survive alone in a forest by accident. Damp gets into everything out here. Cold and rot and time get into everything. Matches like these, dry and waxed and waiting, do not happen on their own. Somebody had protected them. Somebody had wanted them to be ready. I stood there in the dark with that tin in my hands and a question rising in me that I did not yet have the courage to ask out loud. How long ago had this been done? How long ago had someone stood exactly where I was standing and wrapped these matches against a winter they expected to need them in? I set the tin down and I made myself keep looking, because looking was better than thinking, and that was when I crossed to the far side of the room, where a small window looked out over the endless dark sea of the Oregon mountains. The glass was cracked from corner to corner, but through it the view stretched for miles, the fog rolling silver between the ridges under the moon, and carved into the wood of the window frame, right there beside the glass, were 3 letters, W-E-H, Walter Ezra Hartwell, my grandfather's initials. I reached out and ran my fingers over them, and the breath went out of me all at once, because everything else in that treehouse was old, gray and weathered and worn soft by decades of rain and wind and sun. The boards, the stove, the chest, everything bore the same deep age, the same long surrender to time. But these letters were not old. The cuts were sharp, clean. The pale, raw wood inside the grooves had barely begun to darken. Whoever had carved these letters had carved them recently, not when this place was first built decades ago, not 5 years past when my grandfather supposedly wandered off and died. Recently, within the season by the look of the wood. I pulled my hand back from the frame, and I stood there, with my heart pounding in the cold and dark, and the first true twist of the night turned slowly in my chest like a key in a lock. My grandfather had been here, not long ago at all, long after the family had buried his memory and folded it away, long after they had decided he was gone for good. He had stood at this very window in this very room and carved his name into the wood with a steady hand, and the cuts were so fresh and so deep that they seemed almost to be waiting for me to find them. He had not vanished into the mountains and died a confused old man 5 years ago. He had come here on purpose, and he had been here far, far more recently than anyone in my family had ever believed possible. The question was no longer whether my grandfather had built this place. The question was why he had hidden it from every soul who loved him, and why, after all these years, he had wanted so badly to leave his name behind in the one place on earth he had never told a single one of them about. I did not sleep much that first night. How could I? The cold was a living thing inside that broken room. I tried the stove, fed it a few of the dry matches and a handful of old kindling I found in a box beside it. But the pipe was choked with years of soot and dead leaves, and within moments the little room filled with thick gray smoke that stung my eyes and clawed at my throat until I had to smother the fire and throw open the door to clear the air. So there was no warmth. There was only the folded wool blanket which I wrapped around my shoulders, and the sound of the wind high in the branches, and the endless slow creaking of the tree beneath me. I lay on the floor with my back against the wooden chest, and I stared up at that thin blade of moonlight falling through the broken roof, and I listened. Every sound was bigger up there. The scrape of branches dragging across the outer walls, the shifting and settling of old wood under pressure, and far below, somewhere down in the black depths of the forest floor, the small, soft sounds of things moving through the leaves in the dark. Once the whole treehouse leaned, not much, just a slow, heavy tilt as a strong gust came up the mountainside and pressed against the tree, and the platform shifted with it, and my heart stopped dead in my chest. I gripped the edge of the chest with both hands, and I waited for the crack, the snap, the terrible falling away. I was certain in that moment that the whole structure was about to tear loose from the branches and carry me down into the fog. It did not. The gust passed, the tree swayed back, and slowly, my heart began to beat again. That was when I finally understood why no one else in the family had ever come looking for this place. Even if they had believed the map, even if they had found the trail, any sensible person would have taken one look at those rotten steps and that leaning ruin and climbed straight back down before the sun even set. Any sensible person would have called this place a death trap and walked away. But I kept thinking about my grandfather. He had built this place with his own 2 hands. He had survived winters up here, real Oregon mountain winters, long before I was ever born, which meant one of 2 things. Either he had known something about this tree and this treehouse that I did not yet understand, or he had been just as desperate as I was. Sometime after midnight, the rain began. It started gently, a soft patter against the sagging roof, almost soothing, but the mountains do not do anything gently for long. Within the hour, the patter had become a roar, and the wind had risen to meet it, and water began to find its way through the cracks in the roof and drip down onto the floor around me in cold, steady streams. I moved the blanket once, then again, then a third time, chasing the few dry patches of floor that remained as the leaks spread and multiplied above me. And it was there, huddled in the dark and the wet, with the storm screaming through the broken walls of my grandfather's ruined harbor, that the truth of my situation finally settled over me like the cold itself. This treehouse was not going to save me, not as it was, not broken like this, if I did not find a way to make heat, to keep out the water, to repair the worst of the damage, and turn this ruin back into the shelter it had once been. Then it would not be a home at all. It would be my grave. I would freeze up here, alone high above a forest, where no one knew to look for me, in a place my own family did not believe existed. And come spring, if anyone ever found me at all, they would shake their heads and say the same thing they had said about my grandfather, that I had gone strange, that I had wandered off into the mountains, that the wilderness had simply taken me. I pulled the wet blanket tighter around my shoulders, and I made myself a promise in the dark. I would not let that happen. I had not walked 10 miles and climbed into the sky to lie down and die in the rain. My grandfather had survived up here. He had left me matches and a blanket and his name carved fresh into the wood like a message across the years. He had wanted me to find this place. He had wanted me to live in it. I owed it to him to try. And it was exactly then, in the deepest hour of that first terrible night, with the rain hammering down and the wind tearing at the walls and my own resolve barely kindled in my chest, that I heard it. Below me, down in the wet black forest at the base of the tree, footsteps, heavy ones, slow and deliberate and unmistakable, moving through the soaked leaves and the mud circling the base of the great sequoia somewhere far beneath my broken floor. Not the quick light scurry of the small things I had been hearing all night. Something larger, something with the weight of a grown person behind every step. I went absolutely still, the blanket forgotten, the cold forgotten, every nerve in my body strung tight as the fishing line on its nail. I held my breath and I listened, and the footsteps came again, circling, pausing, circling as though whoever was down there in the storm knew exactly where I was and was in no particular hurry at all. And in that frozen moment, with my heart in my throat and the rain roaring down around me, a single thought rose up out of the dark and would not let me go. I had believed I was alone up here. I was not alone. Morning came gray and slow, and somehow I had survived it. The footsteps had faded some time before dawn, swallowed back into the forest, the way everything was swallowed by that place. And though I had not slept, I had not been taken either. The storm had blown itself out. A thin, cold light was creeping in through the cracks in the walls, and the world beyond the broken window had gone soft and white with fog. I sat up stiff and aching and frozen to the bone, and I tried to tell myself the footsteps had been my imagination, the wind, a trick of an exhausted mind in a strange place. I almost believed it, but I knew, somewhere underneath the telling of it, I knew what I had heard. Those were a person's steps, and a person in these mountains, circling my tree in the dead of a storm, was not a comfort. It was a question with a sharp edge to it, and I had no answer for it yet. I forced my stiff legs to carry me to the door, and I made myself climb down the ladder into the fog to face the morning one rotten step at a time, not looking at the ground any more than I had to. Everything below was soaked and dripping from the night's rain, the bark of the great tree gone black with wet, and it was at the bottom of the ladder, as my boots finally touched the solid earth, that I saw the two things that would change everything. The first was hope. Strung between two low branches along one side of the tree, exactly where the morning's runoff would catch, it hung an old plastic tarp, weathered but whole-angled like a funnel toward a rusted metal bucket, set carefully on the ground beneath it, and the bucket was half full of clean rainwater. My grandfather had already solved the first problem: water. He had stood here and built this simple thing so that whoever came after him would not die of thirst in a forest full of rain. For the first time since I had left my uncle's house, I felt something rise in my chest that was almost like a smile. And then I saw the second thing. There in the soft, wet earth, all around the base of the ladder, were boot prints. A man's boots by the size and the depth of them, pressed deep into the mud, half filled now with rain, circling the tree and pausing at the foot of the ladder and circling again. The same slow, heavy track of the footsteps I had heard in the dark. They had not been there when I climbed down to the bottom step the night before in the dry. They had been made in the storm while I lay frozen above listening. And, worst of all, one set of them stopped at the very base of the ladder. The toes pointed up where someone had stood with a hand on the lowest rung and looked up into the branches toward where I slept, and then turned and walked away into the trees. I stood at the bottom of the ladder in the cold morning fog, the rainwater dripping all around me, and I looked from the boot prints to the fog rolling silent through the trees, and a slow certainty settled into my bones alongside the cold. I had come here believing I was running toward an empty place, a harbor with no one in it, a ruin left behind by a grandfather long dead. But the matches had been kept dry, and recently, the name had been carved fresh. The footsteps had circled in the night, and now these prints had appeared in the mud while I slept, a man's prints, deliberate and unhurried, leading right to the foot of the only way up to where I lay sleeping. My grandfather's quiet harbor was not empty at all, and whoever shared this forest with me now, whoever had walked beneath my tree in the storm and stood at the foot of my ladder, looking up, he knew that I was here. The only question left was whether he had come to warn me away or to wait. I climbed back up that ladder with the full bucket of water held against my chest and the boot prints burning behind my eyes, and I told myself I would find the answer. I told myself I had not come all this way lost. Everything climbed into the sky itself only to be frightened back down by sounds in the dark and tracks in the mud. My grandfather had left me a map. He had left me matches and water and his name. He had left me a harbor broken though it was. He had left me something else too. I could feel it now, the way you feel a held breath in a quiet room. There was more here, more that he had hidden, more that he had wanted me to find, more buried in this strange high place than I had begun to imagine. And as I pulled myself back through the door of the treehouse and set the precious water down on the tilting floor, my eye fell on the wooden bed frame against the wall and on the loose boards beneath it that I had not yet thought to look behind. I knelt down. I pried the first board up with my grandfather's old saw, and there, hidden in the dark beneath the place where he must once have slept, lay a second map. It was not the one in my backpack. It was older, more worn, drawn in the same careful hand, but marked with different lines, different symbols, a different path. And every one of those lines led away from the treehouse, away from everything I had found, so far deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest, toward a single point my grandfather had marked with a small dark circle, and one word written beside it in letters pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. I held that second map in my trembling hands in the cold gray light, and I read the word my grandfather had hidden beneath his own bed for me to find, and I understood that my journey into the quiet harbor had not ended when I climbed the ladder. It had only just begun. The word my grandfather had written beneath his own bed was this: harbor, a second harbor, another place deeper in the forest, marked with the same careful hand that had drawn the map that brought me here. For a long moment I knelt there on the cold tilting floor with both maps spread out before me in the gray morning light, looking from one to the other, and the question turned over and over in my mind like a stone in a riverbed. Why two? Why would a man build one secret place and then mark the way to another deeper, still further from the world than even this? I folded the second map and pressed it into the inside pocket of my coat close against my chest, and I made myself a promise that I would follow it when I was ready, when I was strong enough, when I had made this broken place keep me alive long enough to go looking for whatever lay at the end of that hard, pressed line, because that was the truth I had woken to. Before I could chase any more of my grandfather's secrets, I had to survive. And survival that gray cold morning meant solving the problems he had left, half answered, all around me. The boot prints in the mud below were a fear I could do nothing about with my hands. The cold was a fear I could. Water he had given me already. The tarp, the bucket, the clean raincoat, and waiting. But a person cannot live on water alone, and the cold was still the thing most likely to kill me, and so I turned my attention to the stove. The smoke from the night before had taught me the lesson. The pipe was choked. Years of soot and dead leaves and the slow ruin of time had packed it solid, and until I cleared it, there would be no fire, and without fire, there would be no surviving the nights that were coming. So I climbed back down the ladder, making myself step over the boot prints without looking too long at them, and I gathered what I needed from the forest floor. A long, straight branch slim enough to fit the pipe, a handful of stones, moss, damp, and green that I could use to scrub. It took me most of the morning. I worked the branch up the pipe, from inside twisting and shoving, and the soot came down in black drifts that coated my hands and face and turned my breath gray. I scraped the worst of it loose and cleared the dead leaves that some long ago wind had packed into the elbow of the pipe, and I thought as I worked of how my grandfather had once shown me to clean the chimney of his old kitchen stove, his big hands guiding my small ones on the brush, his voice patient and low. When at last I held a lit match to a small, careful pile of kindling, the smoke rose, hesitated, and then drew clean and straight up the pipe and out into the cold morning air. I sat back on my heels and watched the first real fire I had made in that place catch and grow, and the warmth of it touched my face, and for the first time since I had left my uncle's house, My hands stopped shaking from the cold. It is a strange thing what a fire does to a frightened person alone in the wilderness. It is not only the heat, it is the company of it, the sound and the movement, and the small living light of it pushing back against all that gray and cold and silence. I fed it slowly, carefully, the way my grandfather had taught me long ago in his kitchen, and the little room grew warm around me, and the smell of burning cedar filled the air, and I let myself believe just for a moment that I might actually live. But warmth is not food. I had half a can of beans left in my backpack and nothing else, and half a can of beans does not carry a person through an Oregon mountain winter. So once the fire was steady and the worst of the cold had been beaten back, I took my grandfather's old saw and I went down into the forest to see what the land would give me. It did not give much. It was late in the season, and the forest had already begun to pull its bounty back into itself for the winter. But along the edge of a fallen log, not far from the tree, I found a tangle of wild blackberry canes, and though most of the fruit was gone, a few dark berries still clung to the thorns. I ate them where I stood, the tart cold sweetness of them sharp on my tongue, and I filled my pockets with what was left. It was not enough to live on, but it was enough to quiet the twisting hunger in my stomach and enough to give me the strength to keep looking. And it was while I was looking, pushing deeper between the trees than I had yet dared to go, that I found the trap. It was a snare, a loop of wire rigged between two saplings set low to the ground along what must have been a game trail, and it was old, the wire dark with weather, the knots worn soft with time, but it was standing, it was set, and there, threaded carefully onto the trigger, was bait. I stood over that snare for a long time, and the cold that crept into me then had nothing to do with the weather, because a snare does not set itself, and bait does not last out in the open season after season untouched by the rot and the rain. This trap had been set recently. The bait was fresh. Someone had stood exactly where I was standing not long ago at all, and rigged this wire and threaded this bait and walked away, expecting to come back and check it. And the ground around it was disturbed. The leaves kicked and scattered, and there in the soft earth beside the snare, plain as a signature, was a single boot print, a man's boot, the same heavy tread that had circled my tree in the night. Whoever was out here had been here at this snare within the day, setting traps, living off this forest the way my grandfather had taught me a man could. My grandfather had been gone from the family for 5 years, but the name carved fresh in the window, the matches kept dry, the boot prints in the mud, the baited snare set within the week, all of it pointed at one impossible, hopeful, frightening thing. Someone was living up here, someone who knew these woods the way only one man I had ever known could know them. I would not let myself think the word that rose in me. I had buried that hope 5 years ago because the family made me. I would not dig it up now, only to have the cold mountain take it from me again. But I backed away from that snare slowly, the way you back away from something you do not understand, and I made my way home through the trees with the back of my neck prickling the whole way, certain with every step that I was being watched, turning again and again to look behind me into the silent fog and seeing nothing, nothing, always nothing. I climbed the ladder before the light failed, and I bolted the door as best a broken door can be bolted, and I sat by my small fire with my grandfather's saw across my knees, and I waited for a night I was no longer sure I would survive. But the night passed, and the next day I worked, and the day after that, because work was the only thing that kept the fear at bay, and because every board I mended was a board that might keep me alive. I found a rusted toolbox hidden in a corner beneath the bed, full of old nails and a hammer with a split handle, and I used them to reinforce the worst of the loose boards in the floor and walls. Every hammer strike rang out through the forest like a bell, like the treehouse itself was slowly waking up after a long sleep, remembering what it was for. I cleared the rest of the stovepipe until the fire burned hot and clean. I patched the smallest of the leaks in the roof with strips of bark and pitch I gathered from the wounded places on the great tree. With each task, my grandfather's hand seemed to guide mine, his old lessons rising up out of my childhood exactly when I needed them, until I half believed he was standing at my shoulder. And on the third day, I found the thing that changed everything. I had been pulling at a warped wall panel near the stove, meaning to nail it flat, when it came away in my hands entirely, and behind it, hidden in the gap between the beams, was a space, a narrow hidden storage, deliberately made, deliberately concealed, and inside it lay my grandfather's things, his real things, not the abandoned leavings of a confused old man, a hunting knife in a leather sheath oiled and sharp, a hatchet with a sound handle, fishing hooks sealed away in small glass jars against the damp, and wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, a thick bundle of papers covered in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands were shaking as I untied the string. I sat down by the fire, and I unfolded the first page, and there, in the careful slanting hand I had not seen in 5 years, were words my grandfather had written. They were notes, instructions, a whole catalog of how to live in that place, written out plainly for someone he expected to come after him, how to set the snares, which plants were safe and which were not, how to read the weather coming over the western ridge, how to bank the stove at night so the coals would last until morning. Page after page of it, patient and clear, a lifetime of hard knowledge, set down for someone he loved and could not be there to teach in person. And he had known exactly who would read these words. I understood that now. Every line was written the way he used to speak to me in his kitchen, plain and warm and certain as though he could see me reading it. And then I came to a line that stopped my breath. If the storms come early, stay above the fog. I read it 3 times. There was something in it that was more than instruction, something that was almost a warning, almost a plea written with a heavier hand than the lines around it. I did not understand it, not yet, but I felt it settle into me the way a thing you do not yet understand can still take root and wait. I kept reading, and that was when I found the dates. My grandfather had not only written instructions, he had kept a kind of journal among these pages, brief entries marking the passing of his days, and the dates went on and on, far past the autumn 5 years ago, when the family said he had wandered off and died. They marked one winter and another after that. They went on year after year all the way down to an entry dated only a few weeks before the very morning I sat reading it. A few weeks. The breath went out of me. My grandfather had lived up here alone. In this place he had hidden from every soul who claimed to love him for all 5 of the years the family had believed him dead. He had not gone strange. He had not wandered off and lost himself in the mountains 5 autumns ago. He had walked away on purpose, and he had survived up here on purpose, all this time writing it all down for the day someone would come. And he had been alive in this very room only weeks before I climbed the ladder. Weeks. I had missed him by weeks. After 5 years I had come so close, and the cold mountain had taken him before I ever got to tell him I never once believed he was gone. The grief of it bent me double on that floor. But underneath the grief, a colder understanding was rising. The name carved fresh, the matches still dry, the snare with its bait, the boot prints in the mud. If my grandfather had been alive only weeks ago, then someone else was out here now, someone walking these woods in the storm, someone who was not him. And in one of those last entries, written in a hand grown shakier than the rest, my grandfather had written a single line that made the second map burn against my chest like a coal. If they ever drive you out the way they drove me, go to the other harbor. Everything I could not keep safe here, I kept safe there. The other harbor. The dark circle on the second map pressed so hard into the paper, the pen had nearly torn through. He had not built a second secret place out of madness or whim. He had built it as a hiding place within a hiding place, and whatever he had not been able to keep safe in the treehouse, whatever was worth more to him than the matches and the blankets and his own carved name, he had carried deeper into the forest and hidden where no one would ever think to look. I did not sleep that night either, but it was not only fear that kept me awake, it was the words. They drove you out the way they drove me. My grandfather had not chosen to disappear. Not truly. Someone had driven him to it. Someone had made his own home so unbearable that a careful, clear-minded old man had walked away from everything and everyone he knew and hidden himself in the wilderness for the last 5 years of his life. And I knew with a sick certainty that turned in my stomach all through that long, dark night exactly the kind of man who could do such a thing. I had seen that hungry, desperate face across a kitchen table only days ago. I had heard that cold, final voice tell me not to bother coming back. The next morning, I made my choice. I gathered what I needed. I took the hunting knife and the hatchet from their hidden place. I filled my pockets with the last of the blackberries and wrapped a handful of matches in their waxed paper. I drew the second map from my coat and I studied the hard pressed line until I had it memorized, and then I climbed down the ladder and I set off into the deep forest to find the other harbor. The way was hard. The second map led me far past anything I had yet explored, down through a steep ravine where the fog pooled thick as milk across a creek swollen with the recent rain, up a slope so steep I had to pull myself along by the roots and the rocks. The forest grew older and darker. The deeper I went, the trees enormous and silent, the light failing gray and thin between them, and the whole way I felt it again, that prickling certainty that I was not alone, that the man whose boots had circled my tree was somewhere out there, still keeping pace with me through the fog. I did not stop to look. I followed the line on the map, and at last, near the bottom of a hidden hollow, where two great fallen trees had come together over a shelf of dark rock, I found it. Not a house this time, a hollow in the rock, the mouth of it half hidden behind the fallen trunks, dry and sheltered and deliberately concealed. My grandfather's other harbor, the place he had hidden what he could not keep safe. I crawled in through the narrow mouth on my hands and knees, my heart hammering, and in the dim light I saw what he had stored there, a wooden crate sealed tight against the damp, and when I pried it open with the hatchet, I found inside it the things a man hides when he is afraid: dry clothes folded and waiting, sealed jars of food, a second store of matches, and on top of it all, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it dry, an envelope. My own name was written on the front of it in my grandfather's hand, Marlowe. For Marlowe, if you ever found your way here. My hands shook so badly I could barely break the seal. He had written my name. In this hidden place, he had written my name on an envelope and left it waiting for the day I would crawl into this rock and find it. He had known, somehow, against all sense and all the years between us, he had known I would come. I unfolded the letter inside, and there in the gray, dim light of the hollow, with the fog pressing white against the mouth of the rock, and the silence of the deep forest all around me, I began to read the words my grandfather had left for me to find at the end of the world. And what he wrote in that letter turned everything I thought I understood completely on its head. He had not run from the family because his mind had failed him. He had run because of Royce, my uncle, the man who had taken me in, the man who had driven me out, the man who had sat at the head of that cold table going through my grandfather's papers with that hungry, desperate face. My grandfather wrote that Royce had wanted his land, his savings, everything he had built across a long, hard life, that Royce had pressed him and pressured him and tried to make him sign it all away, that when the old man refused, things in that house had turned dark and frightening in ways my grandfather would not put fully into words on the page. So he had done the only thing he could think to do. He had vanished. He had let them believe he was dead, because a dead man cannot be pressured into signing anything, and because as long as they thought him gone, they would stop hunting for what he was hiding. And he had stayed gone all these years, watching the seasons turn from his window in the branches, waiting and trusting that one day the granddaughter who loved the woods would need a harbor and would remember the way. And what he was hiding, the letter said the thing Royce wanted above all else, the thing my grandfather had given his last years in the wilderness to protect, was not in that hollow with me. It was back in the treehouse. I read those words and the blood went cold in my veins, because in the same moment that I understood what my grandfather had been protecting, I understood something else, something that froze me where I crouched in that narrow, dark hollow with his letter trembling in my hands. I had left the treehouse undefended. I had climbed down and walked away into the deep forest, and I had left my grandfather's secret sitting up there in the branches with a door I could not properly lock. And there was a man in these woods, a man whose boots had circled my tree and stopped at the foot of my ladder and stood there in the storm looking up. And from somewhere back the way I had come, somewhere out in the white fog between me and the tree carried thin and faint on the cold mountain air, I heard a voice calling my name, a voice I knew better than I wished to, a voice that had told me only days ago not to bother coming back. Royce had not just sent his boot prints into these woods ahead of me. Royce was here. He had been here for days, circling, searching, waiting, and now he was between me and everything my grandfather had died to protect. I crawled out of that hollow faster than I had crawled into it, my grandfather's letter folded against my heart and his words burning in my mind like the embers of the stove. Royce was here somewhere in the white between me and the tree, and the secret my grandfather had given his last years to protect was sitting undefended up in the branches where I had left it. I ran back through the deep forest the way I had come down the steep slope and across the swollen creek and up through the ravine where the fog pooled thick as milk, and the whole way the voice came and went through the trees, calling, searching, drawing nearer and then farther and then nearer again. He did not know exactly where the tree was. That was the only mercy. He had found the trail, found these woods, walked them for days, setting the snares my grandfather had taught no one else to set, living off the land while he hunted for the harbor. But the second map, the true way in, had been under my grandfather's bed and then in my coat. Royce had been circling close for days without ever finding the tree itself. The sky had begun to change as I ran. The gray of the morning had darkened, thickened, bruised over into something heavy and green at the edges, and the wind had risen out of the west, the way my grandfather's notes had warned. The storms come early. I felt the first cold drops strike my face as I came at last through the trees and into the clearing, and there above me, rising out of the fog into the darkening sky, stood the great sequoia and the broken treehouse clinging to its branches. And standing at the foot of the ladder, looking up, was Royce. He had found it at last. While I was in the hollow, he had stumbled at last upon the clearing, and now he stood there in his heavy coat, with his head tipped back, staring up into the branches at the place my grandfather had hidden from him for the last 5 years of his life. There was something in the set of his shoulders that told me he knew. He had found what he was looking for, and he had come to take the one thing the old man had died protecting. He heard me come into the clearing. He turned, and I saw his face, and it was the same hungry, desperate face I had seen across the kitchen table, only worse now, stripped down to the bone of what he truly was. There was no pretending left in it, no cold civility, just the want. He did not ask me how I had survived out here, or whether I was cold or hungry or afraid. He asked me where it was. I told him I did not know what he meant. And then, with the wind rising around us and the first hard rain beginning to fall, my uncle told me the truth at last. Not because he meant to confess, because he no longer thought it mattered what I knew, because he believed he had already won. He told me he had been the one. He told me that years ago he had pressed the old man to sign away his land and his savings that he had made my grandfather's last years in that house a slow torment of pressure and threat, that he had wanted what the old man had, and he had not cared how he got it. And he told me with something like contempt, curling his lip, that the old fool had run rather than sign, that he had vanished into the mountains like a coward and let the family believe him dead. He told me he had never quite believed it, that he had spent 5 years certain the old man was hiding something somewhere, and that when I bolted into the night with the map, he had finally seen his chance and followed. Days he had spent in these woods, he said, circling, searching, sleeping rough, and setting traps for his food, certain the secret was near, unable to find the cursed tree until now. The boot prints, the footsteps in the storm, the figure at the foot of my ladder in the night, all of it had been Royce hunting through the fog for the very thing I had been sleeping above. He told me all of it, standing at the foot of my grandfather's tree, and the rain came down harder, and the wind began to scream through the high branches, and I understood that everything in my grandfather's letter was true. This was the man who had driven a careful, gentle old man out of his own home. This was the thing my grandfather had spent his last years hiding from. And then Royce turned back to the ladder and began to climb. I shouted at him to stop. I told him the steps were rotten, that the storm was coming, that the whole structure was not safe. He did not listen. He never had. He hauled himself up the ladder rung by rung, his heavy body dragging at the old wood, and the steps groaned and cracked beneath him, and I stood at the bottom in the driving rain, with my heart in my throat, caught between the terror of following him up into the storm and the certainty that I could not let him reach my grandfather's secret first. So I climbed after him. The storm hit in full as we climbed, not rain now, but a wall of it, driven sideways by a wind that howled up the mountainside and tore at the great tree until the whole enormous trunk began to sway. Above me, Royce reached the platform and hauled himself onto it, and I came up behind him soaked to the bone, my hands raw and bleeding on the rope rail, and I pulled myself through the door into the little room where I had spent my first terrible night. Royce was already tearing the place apart. He ripped the wall panels loose, overturned, the wooden chest kicked through the stacked jars, hunting, his face wild in the gray stormlight, and outside the wind rose to a scream, and the whole treehouse began to move. It leaned, the way it had leaned that first night, only worse, far worse, the whole platform tilting as the great tree bent before the storm. The boards groaned. Somewhere above us, a section of the roof tore loose with a sound like a gunshot and went spinning away into the dark. Royce lost his footing and grabbed at the wall, his face changing, now the hunger draining out of it and the fear flooding in, and he looked at me across that pitching, groaning room with the eyes of a man who has just understood he is in a place that is trying to kill him. And in that moment, with the storm tearing at the walls and the tree bending beneath us and my uncle frozen in terror, my grandfather's words came back to me whole. If the storms come early, stay above the fog. I understood it at last, all of it. My grandfather had not built this place high in the branches only to hide from the world below. He had built it high because up here above the fog, above the lower forest, where the storms did their worst, the great tree could do the one thing that would save anyone wise enough to trust it. It could bend, it could sway, it could move with the wind instead of fighting it the way the rigid lower trees could not, the way they cracked and fell, while the great sequoia simply leaned and held. The treehouse was not weak. It had never been weak. It was built to move, and the way to survive the storm was not to brace against it in terror, but to move with it, to trust the tree, to ride the sway the way my grandfather must have ridden it through a dozen mountain winters. Royce did not know that. Royce stood frozen and rigid against the wall, fighting the motion of the tree with every muscle in his body, and the more he fought it, the more the storm seemed to want to throw him down. I did not fight it. I let my knees soften. I let my body move with the sway of the tree, the way you let your body move with the deck of a boat on rough water, and I found the rope my grandfather had left coiled on its nail, and I lashed myself to the great beam that ran the length of the room, the way his notes had taught me to bank against the storm. And I held on, and I rode the bending of the tree, and I survived. The storm raged for hours. The roof tore further. The rain came through in sheets. And somewhere in the worst of it, Royce, fighting the motion, scrambling for a hold that would not move beneath him, lost his footing near the gap, where the roof had torn loose and went down hard against the broken edge of the platform, and could not get up. The fall did not kill him, but it broke something in his leg, and it stole the fight out of him, and it left him lying there in the wind and the wet, no longer hunting for anything at all but the simple animal hope of seeing the morning. I could have left him. God help me in the worst of that night with everything he had done to my grandfather, and to me, I thought about leaving him, but I was not the thing he was, so I lashed him to the beam beside me with the last of my grandfather's rope, and I held on through the dark, and the two of us rode out the storm together in the bending branches of the tree my grandfather had built to save us both. The wind died before dawn. The rain softened, and then it stopped, and a great and terrible silence settled over the mountains. I untied myself from the beam with hands that would barely close, and I crawled to the door, and I pushed it open onto a world made new. The fog had filled the valley below like an ocean white and still and endless, and the first gold light of the morning was breaking over it from the east, turning the whole drowned forest to fire. And the treehouse had survived, battered, broken, further half its roof gone, but standing, still standing high in the branches above the fog, exactly the way my grandfather had built it to. I had survived, and so though he did not deserve, it had Royce. I got him down the ladder somehow in the long, slow hours of that morning, his weight on my shoulder and his broken leg dragging, both of us moving one rotten step at a time. And at the bottom, as I half carried him out into the clearing, we heard the sound of voices, and through the thinning trees came men in the green coats of the Forest Service drawn by the storm, and the report of a truck abandoned on a closed logging road days before. They took my uncle from me. They carried him down out of the mountains on a litter, and they took him away, and as they did, I told them quietly and clearly the things he had confessed to me at the foot of the tree. They wrote it down. They told me there would be questions later down in the world below, and then they were gone, and the clearing was silent, and I was alone again with the great tree and the broken harbor and the fog burning gold in the morning sun. I climbed back up. I do not know exactly why, except that I was not finished, and neither I felt was the tree. I climbed back into that ruined room where the storm had torn everything loose, and I stood among the wreckage Royce had made, the overturned chests, and the scattered jars, and the wall panels torn from the beams, and my eye fell on the one panel he had not reached, the lowest one behind the bed frame near the floor. The boards I had pried up that first morning to find the second map. I knelt down. I worked the panel loose, and behind it, deeper than the space where I had found the second map, deeper than anywhere Royce had thought to look in his wild, tearing search, was one last hidden place. Inside it lay an oilcloth bundle, and inside the bundle, dry and whole and waiting, were papers, legal papers. My grandfather's will, signed and witnessed and dated, and with it the deed to his land and the records of his savings, and a long letter written in a lawyer's careful hand, and in the will in plain and unmistakable language, my grandfather had left everything he had in the world, to me, not to Royce, not to the family that had buried his memory and folded it away, to me, to the granddaughter who had sat on his knee and listened to him talk about the quiet harbor, the only one who had never stopped believing he was more than a confused old man who had wandered off to die. This was the thing Royce had wanted. This was the thing my grandfather had given his last years in the wilderness to protect. Not gold, not treasure, just the truth of what he had wanted, set down in law, hidden in the one place on earth he trusted, kept safe across all the years until the right person came to find it. He had not been hiding from the world. He had been keeping a promise to me. I sat down on the broken floor with those papers in my lap and the gold light pouring through the torn roof, and for the first time since I was 14 years old, I let myself cry. Not the hard, frightened crying of a girl with nowhere to go, the other kind, the kind that comes when you finally understand that you were loved all along, far more and far longer than you ever knew. I cried for the weeks I had missed him by, for the words I would never get to say to his face. But I knew sitting there that he had heard them anyway. He had heard them in every board I mended and every fire I laid the way he taught me. He had known I would come. That was the whole of what he left behind, the certainty that I would come. The weeks that followed turned into the slow, steady work of making a ruin into a home. I repaired the roof completely board by board, learning as I went from my grandfather's notes. I reinforced the ladder, replacing the rotten steps one at a time until a person could climb them without fear. I cleared the stove and built shelves beside it from the wood Royce had torn loose, and I set my grandfather's hunting knife and hatchet back in their places, and I filled the dry jars with the food I gathered as the season turned. I mended the cracked window where his initials were carved, and I left those 3 letters exactly as they were, sharp and clean and fresh, so that anyone who ever climbed up into that place would know whose hands had built it. And near the windows where the sun reached the platform, in the long afternoons, I set out small containers of soil and planted herbs the way my grandmother had once kept them on her kitchen sill so long ago I had almost forgotten. Little by little, the broken treehouse stopped feeling like a shelter I was clinging to in fear. It became a home. Down in the world below, the truth of what Royce had done came out the way truth does once someone is brave enough to say it aloud. The papers my grandfather had hidden made everything plain. The land was mine. The savings were mine. The harbor, both harbors, the whole of what that careful, gentle old man had built across his long, hard life was mine exactly as he had wanted. I could have sold it all. I could have taken the money and walked back down into the valley and lived an easy life far from the cold and the fog and the swaying of the great tree. I did not, because somewhere in those weeks of mending and planting and learning to read the weather coming over the western ridge, I had finally understood the thing my grandfather had been trying to tell me all along, from the moment he sat me on his knee and spoke of the quiet harbor to the last fresh cut of his name in the window frame. Everyone needs a harbor, a place the storm cannot reach, a place that is yours and only yours, where the world stops asking you to be anything other than what you are. He had not built this place so high to hide from the world. He had built it high so that it could survive the world, so that when the storms came, and they always come, it could bend instead of break and ride out the worst of the wind and still be standing when the gold light broke over the fog in the morning. He had built it for me. He had known somehow across all the years that the day would come when they would drive me out the way they had driven him, and that I would need a harbor of my own. And he had spent the last of his life making sure that when I climbed those rotten steps with nowhere left to go, there would be matches kept dry and water caught and waiting and his name carved fresh in the wood to tell me I had come to the right place. Sometimes now at night when the fog rolls white through the valley below and the wind moves through the high branches the same way it did that first terrible evening, I sit by the warm stove in the home my grandfather left me, and I think about the moment I stood at the bottom of that ladder and almost turned around, almost climbed back down, almost let the family and the cold and the fear send me back to a life where I was nothing but a bill that kept arriving in the mail. If I had, I would never have found the one place in all the world where I finally felt that I belonged. And I think on those quiet nights, high above the fog in the harbor, he built for me that my grandfather knew that all along.